see the world through other people's eyes. Now, empathy is a quality of character that can change the world.
Hi, it's Edwin Rutsch, and this is Dialogues on How to Build a Culture of Empathy. And today I'm here with Kay Pranis. Thanks, Kay, for joining me.
Oh, I'm delighted to be here.
So I just want to give a little bit of background about you. I see you're an independent trainer and facilitator for peacekeeping circles, as well as as a kind of a leader within the restorative justice and circle process of movements. And you're doing circle process work in criminal justice, schools, neighborhoods, families, and the workplace. And you have a book titled The Little Book of Circle Process, A New Old Approach for Peace Making. And it's a book that I've heard a lot about. You know, if you're in the circle process field, it's a book that people always talk about. And then you're also co-author of Doing Democracy, Using Circles for Community Planning. And I'm not quite sure your website. I saw one site you have is justcircles.com. Is that your main site, or do you have another website?
I actually don't have a website. So there is information about my work on the Living Justice Press website because they've published most of my books. So Living Justice Press, restoratejustice.org, early on they had some information about me on their site. I've never gotten around to doing a website.
Oh, okay. Well, I can show websites on the screen, so I'm actually just brought up the Living Justice website. So I just showed the screenshots of your books. So yeah, so a lot of times I like to start these dialogues around what people's most important value is in their life. So I was wondering, for you personally, if you're kind of just thinking about your own personal life, what comes up is kind of like the most important value?
This is a question that actually I get to answer frequently because when I do circle training, we always talk about values, and I ask people to think about when they're at their best, what's a value that's really important to them. And the one that I write down most often is love. And for me, in my around 1920, I began to question the faith that I had been raised with, and the whole structure of Christian faith and the concept of God didn't work for me. So I was rethinking all of that, and the question that comes up, I think, in that sort of situation is, what's the purpose of life? Because faith systems generally give you some sense of purpose and order to life. And so I thought a lot about what's the purpose of life. And in the end, the answer that I came to was that the purpose of life is to love and be loved. I thought it left a lot of questions unanswered, but I thought all the faith systems did too. And so that really became the center of my sense of what life's about, is that the purpose of life is to love and be loved. And I don't manage to do that all the time by any means, but when I'm at my best, that's at the center of how I try to show up in the world.
Yeah, my most important value at the moment is empathy. It used to be seeking, questing, because like you, I was raised in I don't know, you're in a religious family, but I was in an evangelical conservative family. So, you know, Republican. And then I went traveling around the world, and it kind of disappeared. And then I really came to me too. It was really, for me, it was like values is really what's important. And
yes, absolutely. I've come to believe that when you talk about values, it's a spiritual conversation. That those values that represent who we are when we're at our best, particularly at our best in relationships with others, that's the center of spirituality. And so that any conversation that's about those values is a spiritual conversation, and it's a way that you can bring spirituality into a space without offending anyone.
Yeah, so we can talk about values and spirituality kind of together without getting into the theology and all that
Right.
religious
And you don't even
theology.
have to you don't have to reference the spirituality. It's that people go to that place in themselves that's about what life means and how they make sense out of life when you talk about values. So people are organically in that part of themselves, even if you don't name that, which is important in our culture because in public processes, we're pretty much forbidden to name spirituality.
Hmm. Yeah, so it's a good entryway into that sound.
Yes,
Then,
I
yeah,
for me it really works.
yeah. Oh, good. It works for me too. We got common ground here. So, well,
And then
you know,
that's the foundation for empathy, right? It's
yeah.
common ground.
That's it. Well, that's one of them. Well, that's what the question I want to have is, what do you see as the relationship then of love to empathy? How is that? What's the connection there for you?
Um, I think love is a space where empathy is relatively easy. I mean, relative to other kinds of spaces. That if you're nurturing the value of love and the way that you live, then empathy um, is an easy projection of love. So they're very bound together, I think, and that the more you can empathize, the more you'll open your heart to the possibility of love. So um, they're mutually reinforcing
Hmm.
empathy. Yeah.
So, on one hand, empathy is kind of like a gateway drug to love.
Yeah,
It's a
it
little bit of a
certainly could
joke.
be.
Yeah.
I
So,
have to think a little bit about does empathy happen without love? Right. So if it's a gateway to love, then you could start with empathy and get to love. I think empathy will certainly deepen love, um, and yeah, it's probably the case that many times it's empathy because empathy may be triggered by something more concrete, and we haven't yet even sort of explored for ourselves internally whether we feel love for someone, but we could respond to something in their story that concretely engages that ability um, to feel for the other, like the other, with the other. Um, so one of the things I was thinking about, and I looked back at the piece that I had written about empathy and restorative justice, and then was thinking about, okay, so what else? um, Empathy requires connection. It fundamentally requires positive connection with the other. And so I think that's where love and empathy really intersect. So because love is about connection and empathy requires connection, that you cannot empathize, I don't think, without being connected in a positive way with the other being, whether it's an animal or a human or whatever it might be.
yeah, is that the article you were referencing, empathy development in youth restorative practices? Is that yeah, we wanted to kind of go into that article where you had talked about youth and what's kind of going on in society in relation to empathy. But before we go there, I want to kind of just explore the notion of empathy, a little bit more. One, we're kind of just looking at the definitions, how empathy and love relate, which is your most important value. And I find that sometimes to kind of explore the experience is to have a metaphor for it. For example, empathy is often seen as standing in someone else's shoes, looking through someone else's eyes. And for me, empathy is like a cornucopia in that as I connect to other people through empathy, it kind of opens up my world to a kind of a richness of experience and feeling. Uh, and I'm wondering for you, if you kind of came up with your own metaphor of empathy, kind of out of your own imagination, what would empathy be like for you personally?
I thought about that a little because I went onto your website and was looking at the various metaphors that people have. I don't, nothing has come from me, and that's interesting because I think metaphorically a lot. I use metaphors all the time around um, concepts that I'm sharing in when I train, and yet, interestingly enough, empathy doesn't have one for me. And when I read through the list on your website, I mean, walking in someone else's shoes is one, of course, that I have heard and is a part of how I've heard empathy defined many times. So that one's very familiar and resonates to some degree. But I don't have a really good metaphor for empathy.
So it's not, one didn't really come to you, they just kind of spoke to you. How about for love? Do you have a metaphor for love?
No, I think that, I think metaphors would be helpful here because I think language itself is limited. Language is linear, language is out of the head, and that both of these ideas, love and empathy, are out of the heart. And so perhaps that's part of the challenge is that it's hard for language to capture what it is we know in a nonverbal way. And both of those, I think, are nonverbal experiences. Yeah, so I'm a wordsmith most of the time, and I'm at a loss.
Well, when it comes to connection, something about the connection one, it doesn't, I mean, it's both, love is very deeply connecting, and empathy is, for me at least, is about kind of coming in connection with someone else. And yeah, I enjoy the metaphors for that reason too, because it seems to combine the emotional with the intellectual somehow, because you get kind of, often the metaphors have like a visceral emotional feel to them. For example, I asked someone a metaphor and they said, well, for empathy, it's like two strings in harmony. So you can kind of feel, what those strings are like. And what's the opposite? And they said it was like, hands going down a chalkboard, is the opposite of empathy. And someone else said, well, empathy is like water because it can take any shape, because it's taking on the emotional shape of someone else. And for them, the opposite was ice, which is rigid and will not take on the shape of the other.
Nice. I do think it is the case that metaphors help us express both emotional content and sort of cognitive content. And I guess I have not put, I've not asked myself to do this in a way that has produced something useful.
Well, usually I send people the questions beforehand. I don't know if I did that, so I kind of prepare people for,
You did, and I
Oh,
looked
did
at
I?
it. And I looked at it, but
It
I didn't spend a lot of time on that particular one because nothing came to me, and then I usually say, okay, then I move
Oh,
on.
okay. Oh,
Work on
okay.
something
Great.
else.
So maybe something will come during during the continuation of our dialogue here. So one thing we wanted to do was to kind of explore your article, which you'd written in 2000. So you'd thought about empathy, quite a while back, and uh, what I thought we could do, if you'd like, is kind of go through this article you had about empathy in children and kind of what alienation that sometimes happens there, and it seemed like the fear that comes out of alienation.
Yes, I thought about that a lot in the early work in restorative justice that I was doing because in the processes, the restorative processes where you're bringing people face to face, you're hoping to trigger empathy on both sides. Trigger empathy on the side of the offender for the person that they hurt, and where there might be underlying causes that represent hurt for the offender, you also want to generate empathy for that, because ultimately what restorative justice is about is healing for anybody who is harmed by crime, and that includes the person who commits the crime, the person who might be victimized, in the larger community. And I saw a lot of people expecting young people who had committed crimes to have empathy for their victims, and their own lives had been so harsh that it just made sense to me that how can these young people feel empathy for someone they victimized if they haven't experienced empathy in their own lives? And a lot of them had been through a lot of harsh things with not a lot of support, maybe no empathy at all. And so I felt that I began to think about, if we're expecting empathy from these young people, what are the conditions that are necessary? And I was hearing from people, I sort of fell into the field, didn't have that kind of background that we normally would have. And people who'd been in the field of working with juveniles in corrections or in various kinds of programs related to corrections, they would often say that there was a difference in young people now, that they used to be able to find empathy in them, and that now they're very hard and don't show empathy. So I began to think about, well, what might that be about? And began to try to figure out, what does it take to develop empathy in someone? And the three things that seem to me are absolutely necessary, and there may be more, but the three that really struck me that are necessary to develop empathy is you have to have feedback about your behavior conducted in a respectful way. Right? If we never get feedback about our behavior, it's hard for us to know if we're having a negative impact and therefore care about that. So you need regular feedback about behavior presented in a respectful way, that you would need to know that you were loved and cared about. If you didn't have relationships in which you were valued and treated with respect, then why would you care if somebody else feels bad or feels hurt? And that, thirdly, you would need to experience other people having empathy for you when you hurt. And what really struck me when I began to think about that is that very, very few young people have all three conditions. Because even in homes where there's a lot of caring, where everything else seems strong, the fact is that you need these things delivered not just by your family, but by your community, particularly the feedback about your behavior. That if you don't get feedback about your behavior, you can't develop a sense of how you fit in and how you impact others. And that's really necessary for community. For community to be effective, you have to have a process of reciprocity where people understand their impact on others, and then modify their behavior if their impact is not good and they care. So if you care about the other person, the impact of your behavior isn't good, then you're generally going to modify your behavior. That feedback system of reciprocity still happened in families, but was very broken down in communities. So that there are actually very few young people who were growing up with steady flow of constructive feedback about their behavior. And that without that, it's very hard to build. It's hard to build community. It's hard to build a culture of empathy.
Yeah, I don't remember. Was there a conclusion? I have it up here. I see. So you're basically just saying that the society in itself is not really a culture of empathy, that the children are not receiving empathy, it's not being modeled to them. And I kind of read it as a form of alienation. If you're not being empathized with, you're feeling, disconnected. And then, you do crime, some form of crime or harm to someone else, and people are saying, well, why doesn't this person care about me, this child? And it's because they haven't kind of really been nurtured in an empathic environment, and it hasn't been really modeled for them.
Yeah, so I think we have multiple things going on that undermine empathy. And one of those that I talked about in the article is that we have left it to nuclear families to raise the children. The community has backed away from being a part of raising all the children in the community, both in terms of holding them accountable and also in terms of loving and caring about what's happening for them. So that young people born after 75, around 72, 72 to 75, I found there was a real shift. People who grew up, who were born before 72, generally experienced that adults other than their parents in community would hold them accountable, would give them feedback, but also might pay attention to whether they needed something. And then after 70, at 72 to 75, that young people would generally say that no, adults other than their parents or people who were paid, like teachers, police officers, social workers, youth workers, those folks would talk to them about their behavior, but the community member would not. And it created an environment in which young people felt that nobody cared about them except their family and people who were paid. And the people who were paid part is corrosive. They only care about me because they're paid. And so so young people grew up with no sense of having a responsibility to community because community wasn't conveying a sense that the community was responsible for them, either good or bad, in terms of monitoring the behavior to make sure it was okay, or supporting them when they have needs. And that has created a great distance between young people and the adults in the community. And that because of very serious juvenile crime, I wrote that around 2000. So at that point, there was a lot of media portrayal of adolescence as violent and kind of monstrous, in that adults had become afraid, afraid to interact, afraid to say to someone, some adolescent who's using a swing that really a small child ought to have access to, the adults standing around and doing nothing because they're afraid to speak to a teenager. And I think that adults afraid of teenagers is a very, very unhealthy kind of culture to be in. That did happen to a friend of mine, that these young people were sitting on the swings and the little children were all waiting around looking sad, and a bunch of adults were standing around doing nothing. And she went up to the young people and said, no, you need to give the little children a chance to use these swings, and moved it on. But that a lot of adults had stood there and were trying to figure out what professional they could go call to change this situation. So this disconnect between young people and adults is, I think, a serious problem in our culture. And as I talked about earlier, empathy requires connection, and empathy builds connection. It requires connection to get started, and then the process of feeling empathetic to another builds connection to that other. So then you can safely speak to a young person. You have to care about who they are and what's going on with them before you have the standing to reprimand them in some way. And so I see the empathy as really central to building that kind of relationship where adults have the standing when an adolescent is acting out to be able to call that to account. But you're not effective in calling that to account if the person doesn't think you care anything about that. So the empathy is really foundational.
Well, I think of my experience, and I just walking down our bike path here, and maybe there'll be a group of young, kids, teenagers, junior high, whatever, and I can feel some anxiety in myself, right? There's like this sense of of distance, and I don't know how they're going to act. They're young. They could do anything, and it's happened before. Somebody throwing something just out of for the hell of it, and that creates like a distance. There's a distance. There's a feeling, the cultural feeling in the air of this kind of anxiety, and that anxiety kind of is maybe fear as well. It's like it's like a low level of fear, and it actually can kind of get even worse. So, which is what your article is saying, is this fear is kind of created, and so it's like how to reduce. What can we do in society to reduce that fear? And I think you were saying that one way you saw was kind of restorative process was.
Yes, all of that sort of fear I think is very common, and I think, and the flip side of it for young people is that they don't feel cared about by the adults, and so they have a fear, different kind of fear. It's more of a social fear that they'll be rejected by the adults, and so I think they often reject first. Your best protection against rejection, if you're in that fearful place, is to be the rejecter yourself, and so they'll engage in behavior that pushes people away. But underneath that, in every human being, it's a deep desire to be connected. But it's such a vulnerable place to acknowledge that you want to be connected. They can't do that, and it really rests on the adults to figure out how to get past this barrier, because it's too much to ask at that age when the need to belong is so overwhelming. The fear of rejection is enormous. It's the adults who have to get past our fear and our anxiety about what's going on with him. And they won't always respond positively, but most adults are surprised if they begin to do the first positive sort of reaching out to the young people, then often it's a positive response that you get. But the restorative practices, it seems to me, they organically work to break down that distance between young people, particularly young people in trouble, and the adults in their community, because all of the restorative processes involve having people tell their stories of pain if they've been hurt, but they're told in a way that's not accusing or blaming. It's very hard for us to put our defenses up around painful stories if no one's attacking us. So the story actually gets inside, right? And you hearing the story, you have some sense of the pain that the other person went through. And that's where empathy becomes triggered. And so these processes are a process where everybody gets to tell their story. So that might include the person who caused harm, the offender, also telling something about the story of their lives, which allows us to see that there's a lot of pain there. And someone once said in one of my trainings that we meet at our woundedness. We meet at our woundedness. That when we share some of the places of pain and woundedness in our lives, we connect. It is a point of connection for human beings. Very, very common. And if a person feels respected, they're not defended against connection. If you feel you're going to be attacked, you've got walls up that will not allow connection to happen. If you're being treated really respectfully, it's actually quite difficult to put those walls up against connection. We tell our stories of pain from whatever direction they come from, and the connection happens, and empathy happens for the other. So the storytelling organically builds empathy, and the point of the restorative process is to understand the impact of behavior, and that's a big part of moving to empathy, is to first understand the impact of behavior and then care if that impact was negative on someone else. And at the same time, because some of these processes involve more than just the immediate participants in an event, they involve community members, you begin to build a culture of empathy, not just an experience of empathy between two people, but you've got an experience of empathy in maybe 6 to 10 people. And now you begin to move past just the individual interactions and you start to build that sense of everybody can share their story and everybody can pay attention to what it feels like in someone else's shoes. You have to walk in them, but feel for a moment what that person is feeling when they're telling their story. And it's this storytelling that I think is so central to empathy development. It's not a cognitive thing. And stories are not a highly cognitive thing. Stories are a very emotional thing and often a spiritual thing as well. So it's the storytelling from the heart, right? And it's never about persuasion and it's never about convincing others that because persuasion and convincing come out of this headspace. We're highly defended against information that comes in that form. Somebody giving us advice, somebody lecturing us, never gets in because we're highly defended. But somebody telling their story, we're open to that because of curiosity. Human curiosity is open to that if it doesn't feel like some message or lesson is being jammed down our throats. Even if it's a good lesson, human beings are resistant, right? They're being told what to do. We have this desire for autonomy. So the storytelling as the way of sharing possibilities, sharing understandings, sharing what something feels like, that's at the core of the restorative processes. And I think storytelling is probably in a space that's respectful and reflective. Be very careful. Storytelling can result in negative things if you don't have the right kind of space. You need a space that's respectful to everyone within it and reflective. Right? Doesn't move too fast. People think before they speak. They get a chance to really let their words come up. You don't have a lot of crosstalk with people reacting too quickly to what someone said. That in that environment, the stories produce empathy.
Well, I don't know where to kind of quite go next with this because I've taken, in our local mediation center here in Berkeley, I've taken some workshops on restorative justice and been in circle process. And I've seen that it's really, for me, I came to the conclusion that empathy is really the central kind of a value in the sense that when people say it's restoring, it's restorative justice or restorative process, it's about restoring connection between people or even creating connection where there hasn't been connection. Or if there has been connection, it's deepening that already existing connection. And when I talked to the people, when I talked there, I said, well, really isn't empathy kind of central to this? And somehow I don't kind of get anywhere with that. It's like there's something about the restorative circle or restorative community, the restorative justice community, they're very fixated. There's a fixation on the justice component of it. And I've been kind of frustrated about it because it feels like it's really about empathy because it's like there's a metaphor, for example, right? For me, a metaphor of justice is kind of the scales, two people kind of with the scales are kind of coming to some kind of equilibrium, whereas empathy is really about this intertwining and connection with someone else. And it has it's a very different kind of underlying metaphor, I guess, or I don't know if that's...
It's a hugely different metaphor underneath. My metaphor for justice is healing, right? And healing is more like the hands coming together. So healing is about restoring oneself to that best self. So healing for someone who caused harm means restoring myself, when I've caused harm, requires me taking responsibility and taking action to repair the harm. It's healing. So that's where accountability comes in, is that in order for me to heal, if I caused harm, I have to take responsibility, acknowledge that I caused harm, understand the nature of the harm, and take steps to repair it. But a lot of restorative work gets hung up on accountability. That's not central for me. Accountability, I believe, is a byproduct of healing and healthy love. And so it's there. It's not that it isn't present and we need to pay attention to it, but that healthy love wants accountability for someone we love, right? Because if someone you love has caused harm, you know the best way for them to heal is to face up, do the difficult thing of acknowledging, and take action to repair the harm, because then they'll get healthy and strong inside. That if some way they're able to squeak around it and not be responsible for some harm they caused, you know that's not good. So you want for your loved one that there'll be a process where they take responsibility and do something to sort of expiate the shame that comes organically with causing harm to others. The problem is that our justice system creates such a threat to human beings, harming them, that those who care about them have to rally around to try to protect them from the justice system. And then they end up appearing to condone, when that isn't really what they want to be doing, but there's so much threat of harm and inappropriate harm by the system. So I think it's about restoring each of us to the possibilities of best self, and in that restoring community, because the human beings evolved in community. Our genes have to carry the information for how to be successful in community, how to be in good relationship with others. We live in a culture that undermines how to be in good relationship with others in many, many, many ways. But we have underneath that a profound genetic impulse to be in good relationship with others. And empathy is obviously a huge part of how to be in good relationship with others, because empathy continues to build and nurture the relationship when threatening things cross it, when there's difference, unexpected difference, and people start to feel farther apart. Empathy is what can pull them back together again. So this culture that we're in is constantly undermining that enormous human capacity to be in good relationship with others. We also have the capacity to do harm. This is not in any way denying our capacity to do harm, but what we will see in human behavior is what we nurture. And in our culture, we nurture disconnection, we nurture anger, we don't nurture love or compassion. People often talk about these processes as soft. My response is, which is harder in this culture? To talk in public about love and compassion, or to talk about anger and hate? It's a lot easier in this culture to talk about anger and hate in public than it is to talk about love and compassion. It's talking about love and compassion that takes the most courage. So this kind of work that we're doing, I agree with you. I think empathy is very central to the restorative justice work. I would say, but my way of expressing that has been a little bit different, but we talked earlier about how close love and empathy are. When I say about circles in particular, the practice that I'm most familiar with is that love is at the center of the circle. Okay? Accountability will flow from healthy love. And it's not that everyone in the circle loves each other. They don't necessarily. Sometimes they do, but they don't necessarily. But that the circle must love everyone, which means the community must love every one of its members, even in the really hard times. And so I've thought of it as love at the center, but love and empathy go hand in hand. If you really love and are offering love to others, empathy is going to be there, and your empathy is going to build your love. So that that's a self. The two are mutually reinforcing. But for me, love is at the center of the restorative justice work, particularly of the circle process. And that's about healing. When something has gone wrong between human beings, how do we heal? Heal the individuals, heal the relationship, heal the other relationships around them that got impacted by that incident.
So it sounds like for you, you're saying that within the circle, it's really love. It's kind of a space of love, and which I guess is connection and that warmth, and that's a place for healing disconnection between people.
Yes.
Uh-huh.
Now, I wouldn't tell people I'm inviting to a circle that this has to be a space of love. But I do think that because people, if you're the victim in some kind of offense, you are not interested in going into a space of love for the toward the offender. So that's why it's not about the individuals in the circle having to love each other. It is about understanding that the circle as a space must hold everyone in dignity and love. Mm-hmm. And for me, then, what you're thinking about is the circle as a space represents the community must hold everyone in dignity and love, and hold that every one of us has this potential for the best self, that all of us at the core have this good and unblemished self. And there may be lots of surface stuff over that. It might not be visible. But the way I think about this circle process that I use is that this process is designed to help us be in touch with our own best self and the best self of others. And that we can see others, we can see the best in others and find it in ourselves. And that place of the best self is clearly going to be infused with empathy, right? Because it's connection. If we understand ourselves as so profoundly connected, then we must feel what others feel. Right? At some level, we feel it, and it impacts us. And we need to care because it impacts us. That nothing exists in isolation, separated from the other. That's not the nature of the universe. It's not only not desirable, it just isn't the nature of the universe. And so empathy is one of the expressions of connectedness, of relationship, and by connectedness, meaning that everything we do impacts all the rest of the universe. That there is no separation. You are me and I am you. I mean, is that the Ubuntu concept? I mean, one of the important African words.
Well, it's I am me because there's something about I am me because of you. Kind of, I think that's the Ubuntu, something like that.
Yeah. There's another, when we were thinking about metaphors, I'm thinking, okay, so there's one that maybe fits. I haven't worked this out, so I'll do it here. There's an idea called Indira's net. Is that right? And it comes from, I think, South Asian culture. The idea that we're all connected in a web, and at every point, you're connected to every point, and you're also a mirror to every other point on the web. And that's the nature of the universe, that each of us is connected to every other point in the net, and each of us reflects every other point in the net. So in some way, I think empathy maybe is that mirror. There were several mirror metaphors on your website, and they weren't working for me particularly at the moment that I read them. But when I think about the Indira's web image, then that connects to empathy for me.
So it's a whole web of mirrors, like kind of almost like a spider web of mirrors. At each point, maybe is a mirror, kind of like that kind of picture.
Kind of, but you have to think n-dimensional. Okay, spider's web is kind of two-dimensional. Mm-hmm. three,
Mm.
but you have to begin to be able to think of many, many, many dimensions and complexity, but every point connected to every other point, and every point mirroring the whole.
Mm.
I think that the hologram is another metaphor that's very useful for thinking about um, these ideas generally. So if I understand this correctly, right? I know just enough probably to be dangerous on these ideas. That with a hologram, you could keep dividing it into pieces, and though you cut it in half, each half still has the whole image. It gets fuzzier, right? It has less detail, but you go down to the tiniest piece of this, and it still has the whole in it, even though you've gone down to a very, very tiny piece of the original thing. And again, it's fuzzier by that time, but that this idea that each of us carries the whole of the universe in us in some way, and that that for me would be sort of that's the root of empathy, right? Because we are different and appear to be separate, but somehow we also carry the the whole of the universe in each of us, and empathy for me just naturally flows from that kind of understanding.
Mm. Well, that fits very much with the scientific understanding of mirror neurons. I don't know if you've looked into mirror neurons, and
I haven't. I saw those things and thought that looked interesting, but I
yeah.
haven't.
Well, it's really the biological underpinnings of empathy. It's that when we do an action and we see an action, the same neurons fire in our brain. So as I see you shaking your head, even though I'm still, the neurons that if I shook my head like you do, they actually fire to simulate the experience, your experience. So it's like, how do I know what you're feeling? It's through these neurons that fire when we do the action or see the action. So if you're in a room and you're aware of a lot of different people, your body is kind of simulating the whole room as if it's inside of yourself. So it very much scientifically um, mirrors or reflects what you're talking about, kind of in the metaphor.
Interesting, and interesting that this is a very ancient idea um, that that so long ago people had these understandings that are now being sort of validated by modern science.
Yeah.
And I find it very true in the circle work that I do is very rooted in Native American and First Nation um, worldviews, and that a lot of the sort of elements of their worldview are now validated by modern physics, quantum physics.
Yeah, it's that throughout history, people have just intuitively picked up on how our experience works, and now there's actual neuroscience that's kind of showing how it works at a physiological level. Yeah. And the other, I guess, one thing I have with the restorative justice community here, I keep talking to them about empathy, and it's so central to this, and it's like I was actually going to do a curriculum with them, and it's like it was just a nightmare, kind of working on it, because somehow they're so fixated on on the justice component, and I think maybe what's missing is the mirror neuron, the science of it, in the sense that we're always empathizing. It's not like suddenly empathy happens. Is that we cannot, as biological creatures, almost not empathize because that mirror neurons is happening all the time.
You can't
And
actually shut that off.
yeah, you can. There's things you can do when you become afraid, right? Your fear is kind of pulling your awareness, into yourself. So it is inhibiting kind of the awareness and the mirror neurons effect, as well as if you're judging people and you're in a fight, you're kind of shutting it down. So there's a whole slew of things that actually affect the shutting down of that mirroring. So the way I kind of see it is we're always empathizing. It's how do we turn up the dial of empathy? And like you're saying, the culture is saying, individualism is good. Everybody's on their own. The science was saying we're all greedy and selfish. And so it's creating these barriers, kind of conceptual, emotional barriers. And it seems to me that the process you're doing, restorative process, is bringing people together so they can start kind of clearing the mirror, right? It's like the stuff that's
Yes,
in between the
because
mirrors. We got to clean. We got window cleaner. We got to clean clean off the judgment, clean off the fear, clean off the alienation and whatnot.
exactly, because it really is. Those processes are about clearing away those barriers to connection and empathy, and to that mirroring process that you're describing. That's very much what those processes are about. Um, there are times when I think, well, part of the thing is that for me, I didn't come from the justice system. I got into this work accidentally, and for me, it's always been about community and not about crime. Crime creates an opportunity to build community because there's energy around it. You can get people to come to some kind of process, otherwise they wouldn't come to. But that the restorative processes transform that negative energy into positive community building energy when they work well. And and they're doing that because they're clearing the space, they're clearing away those barriers to empathy that are a part of our daily life in our culture, and then amplified when one causes harm to another. Right? So the barriers are there all the time in our culture, but they're considerably amplified when one causes harm to another. So this process that clears some of those barriers away and then opens up the possibility of connection and the mirroring. That's what the restorative justice stuff is about. And for me, that's ultimately about building community and healing more than it is about crime.
Yeah, so it's like there's a conflict, and you can use that conflict to kind of bring people together. But there's another level of that you can bring people together. It's like those children you're talking about, right? They're feeling alien. They haven't had a conflict with anyone. What's happening is they're not being raised in a culture that's fostering empathic connection. They're not being seen and related to and kind of empathically nurtured. They're not seeing themselves reflected in the adults and whatnot. They see kind of a barrier, perhaps, and that kind of amplifies maybe this sense of barrier. So it seems to me we need, like, before we even get to that restorative justice, we need like just a restorative empathy process to develop the resilience to kind of head off, a lot of those problems before they even get to that
Yes.
restorative justice.
Yeah, and
Like,
that's actually a lot of my work now is helping people learn how to use circles in ways that are not in the justice system, and particularly in schools. And that's very much about essentially around prevention, right? About creating these spaces of caring and spaces of connection. And um, and so I'm just thinking also that, so maybe I have had a metaphor. I didn't think of it as a metaphor, but what I talk about a lot in Circle is that it's about helping us see, particularly the storytelling, is about helping us see ourselves in each other, right? So to see myself in the others. Because when somebody else tells their story, there'll be some piece of that story that resonates to some experience in my life. And that when we begin to see ourselves in each other, then it breaks down the stereotypes and the judgments and the othering, the distance that we have created in some way to judge another person. So I suppose empathy is about that capacity to see ourselves in each other.
well, that's kind of leading into something I had wanted to talk to you about as well, because I see, what we're trying to do. I don't know how your time is. Are you on a schedule, or Can you go over a few minutes? Or
Yeah, oh, yeah, I can go over a few minutes.
okay, oh great. I didn't want to. We had talked about an hour. I could, I can go for hours about this. So it's we want to create a movement to create a culture of empathy and looking like how can we do that. And I see one process is the circle process, and something that we're doing is starting what we call empathy circles via Skype, like 4 people, maybe 5 in a maximum. And what we're using is reflective listening. So we have the overall vision, intention, I guess, would be for a culture of empathy. And then the circle is to bring your problem, your celebration, your exploration, uh, your insight into building a culture of empathy to the circle. And then you share, and then with reflective listening, you speak specifically to one person, they reflect back, and then once you're fully heard, then that person speaks and is reflected back by whoever they want to speak to. And so it's a very reflective group process, but the intention is to build a culture of empathy and foster empathy and see how we can build a movement to do that. So one thing I thought, since I have you here, I can tap into your massive experience in circle process and the dynamics of circle process, just to kind of hear what you kind of think of that, or ideas you would have of how to structure a circle like that.
So circles, I'm thinking about this because that's creating a space that doesn't necessarily relate to the ongoing life of the individuals, as I heard you describe it.
It is the ongoing, because it's wherever you are in your life personally in terms of creating a culture of empathy. Like someone said, well, I'm really concerned about confidentiality in these groups because we actually record them directly to YouTube, so they're actually online, and we have several already online. So confidentiality, I'm really concerned about confidentiality. So this is like personal to them. It's like, oh, you're really concerned about confidentiality. And we just kind of do the reflective listening, exploring kind of where that person is.
And what do you see as the empathy being built in that?
Well, if the empathy is the mirror neurons, that we're the mirroring of each other, we're wanting to kind of create that reflection in each other. So by doing reflective listening, we're actually slowing things down. The person is sharing where it is that they are, and then they're getting it reflected back. And if there's not a competition for time or space, because you have as much time to speak as you want until you're fully heard on that piece, and it seems to come to a natural conclusion. And then whoever was kind of doing the reflection and hearing, then they get to speak. So in the reflection, you're hearing yourself reflected back, and that's like kind of helping that mirror neuron process, which happens at a kind of a subconscious level. It's kind of making it a bit more explicit and conscious.
So that I should, if you have some of that's on YouTube, maybe I should take a look. That sounds like a little different process. So normally what would happen in a circle is you have a talking piece and you have a group of people who, for whatever reason, have come together. Sometimes around a topic, sometimes around some kind of issue or event. And you pose a question or a topic to the circle. But first you do some work to create safe space. We'll assume that we've done that. Then you pose a topic, or and the question could be, what are you struggling with in your life? And the talking piece would go around, and each person would speak to what they're struggling with in their life, and might respond to something that someone else had said, but might not, right? So then a number of things are in there in the center of the circle. And then you allow people, you pass again with the talking piece and see what threads do people respond to or follow. So you wouldn't get such a target normally in the circles of life. You wouldn't get such a targeted process of one person speaking and everyone reflecting back to them, and then another. And it's not that you could modify the circle to do that. But one of the things that's really interesting about circle is related to chaos theory, that it's not a real linear path. So a lot of things may be put in the circle, and then you allow it, the talking piece, to keep going around and see how do people sort that out? How do they respond to it? What does that bring up for people? What stories do people share related to something out of? But it's a little different, I think, than the process that you've been creating.
What do you see as the intention when you're bringing a circle? What's the intention that you're holding there?
Oh, it varies. I mean, each circle can have its own intention. So I just did a circle on Friday for a historical sexual abuse case, and that in that circle, the purpose of that circle was to support the person who'd been victimized. So that was the focus of that. There will likely be another circle to support the person who caused the harm. And if it works well, at some point, people could be brought together so that they hear each other directly. And that's a typical process in the context of the justice system. In a school, let's say a classroom, they might regularly do check-in circles, and the purpose of those circles is for them to share more of who they are with each other and let each other know about stuff that might be going on for them that matters. So that one kid comes in really tired and says, I didn't get much sleep last night. There was a lot of noise in the street and I couldn't get to sleep. And then the whole classroom can be more patient with that person throughout the day because they heard from that person. Another person may talk about something wonderful happened the night before. So that kind of check-in circle is a community building circle where people are getting to know more of the little pieces of each other's lives, so they connect. More empathy is more likely in that classroom when something goes awry. Yeah. So circles are used in a lot of different ways, and each one figures out its own sort of intention and purpose.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so if you had insights into how to foster the empathy, I mean, it's really like how do we build an empathy movement with circle process?
Yeah, so how we nurture more empathy in our culture is, I think, to use a lot more circles would be one of the key strategies. And then an empathy, a circle that's really exploring empathy and how we build it. The question is, where does the capacity is there. We all have this capacity for empathy. And where you want to be really building it is where people are polarized, right? Where people are, so for an empathy circle, I'd be interested in finding a set of people where maybe half and half, they are in completely different places around a particular issue, very polarized. They would normally not be able to listen to each other at all or hear cleanly what the other person is saying, have any understanding of why the other person looks at it the way they do, and that you create a space of circle for people to share. And they initially share things not related to the topic, right? So we can see ourselves in each other before we see our differences. and then allow people to talk about where their perspective comes from. What are the stories in their lives that relate to why they look at it this way? And for me, building empathy is going to be most powerful around real concrete differences that cause people to see each other in very hostile, limited, two-dimensional ways.
Yeah, so it's kind of the conflict areas is where you really see it kind of working the best, then, and maybe where the most energy is. Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, there's actually in 3 weeks I've set up what I call it's the empathic mediation circle. When I get 2 Republicans and 2 Democrats, I have Joan Blades, who is a co-founder of MoveOn.org. She's on board, so I just need 2 conservatives and another progressive, and she actually knows 2 people who might be able to get. So I actually want to try that out. It'll be using Skype, and we'll be recording it too.
So there's a risk you have to be willing to take to be
Mm-hmm.
empathic, and that is the risk that the other person will change your mind.
And not take part?
No. That if you are willing to engage in a process that's trying to build empathy, so let's say you have very strong feelings from a progressive point of view, if you are to engage in a truly empathic way, you have to be open to the possibility that your mind will be changed on that issue.
Oh yeah, uh-huh.
Yeah. And that's what we're asking of people, if they would participate in something like that.
Yeah, you might be changed. Your life might change. You might see things differently.
It might be different.
It might be dangerous.
It gets harder to be
dogmatic,
but yeah, it gets really harder to be dogmatic when you start developing empathy, and sometimes that's a very safe place for people. Things are very black and white. It's very clear that this kind of work requires us to be in a place of ambiguity a lot and uncertainty about what the truth really is.
Well, I've been to the Tea Party rallies, and I've interviewed Tea Party members about empathy. I was more in the progressive side of things. I'm kind of moving to a third position. I'm part of the empathy party movement now. We're kind of in between, kind of the mediators, I see it. So I've been to the Republican state convention here in California, the Democratic one as well, and interviewed, both sides about empathy. So now the next step is to bring them together and have them talk together about their values and how they relate to empathy.
Yeah. Should be interesting.
Yeah. So that was. So yeah.
I'm gonna need to.
Okay.
Go now.
Great. Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks, Kay, for sharing your insights into the restorative justice and the circle process. It's been a really insightful for me discussion.
Thank you. I've really enjoyed it.
Okay.
Okay. Take care.
Let's go there. Bye.
See the world through other people's eyes. Now, empathy is a quality of character that can change the world.